The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the usual diplomatic chatter as representatives from 40 different species debated trade routes and mineral rights. Ambassador Kyle Morrison sat in the human delegation seat and listened to the Vrexian Empire complain about tariffs on crystalline exports, which seemed like the most boring thing he had heard all week. Kyle had been humanity's voice on the council for 7 years now, and most days involved exactly this kind of tedious negotiation. Humanity had joined the galactic community 200 years ago and had built a reputation as reliable traders, curious explorers, and surprisingly emotional beings who formed attachments to almost anything, including small animals and fictional characters. His attach Amanda. Pierce leaned over and whispered something about lunch after the session ended. Kyle nodded absently while the Talarian collective representative droned on about shipping lane disputes. The truth was that humanity had carved out a comfortable niche in galactic society. They ran medical stations, operated merchant vessels, established peaceful colonies, and generally stayed out of the major power struggles that consumed species, like the Krath Dominion or the Vrexian Empire. Other races found humans odd with their constant need for social bonding and their strange insistence on protecting weaker species. But odd was not threatening, and humanity had been careful to present themselves as helpful rather than dangerous. Council Speaker Velanara, an ancient being whose species had founded the council millennia ago, called for a vote on the Vrexian tariff proposal. Kyle voted with the majority to table the discussion for another session and checked his datapad for messages. That was when everything changed. Priority alert flashed across his screen with a code he had never seen used in actual practice, only in drills and worst-case scenario training. His blood went cold as he read the source location. New Haven Colony. Amanda noticed his expression shift and asked if something was wrong. Kyle did not answer immediately because he was reading the details of the transmission and feeling something dark and old wake. Up in his chest, New Haven was a small human settlement on the edge of council space with about 50,000 civilians, including 15,000 children. The colony existed primarily as a farming community that supplied food to nearby stations and served as a waypoint for explorers heading into uncharted regions. The settlement had minimal defenses because it had never needed them. Just a small orbital platform with outdated shields and maybe 20 security personnel who would train more for crowd control than actual combat. Kyle pulled up the full report and felt his jaw tighten. A Krath Dominion war fleet had arrived in the system 3 hours ago, and the Krath commander had issued an ultimatum to the colony director. The message was simple and brutal. Evacuate all personnel within 24 hours, or the Krath would remove them by force. The reason was equally straightforward. New Haven sat near a cluster of asteroids rich in rare elements that the Krath wanted for their expanding military infrastructure, and they saw no reason to negotiate with a colony that could not defend itself. Amanda read over his shoulder and gasped. She immediately suggested filing an emergency petition with the council for intervention. Kyle knew the process well. He would submit the request. The council would debate jurisdiction since the Krath were members in good standing. They would form a committee to investigate, and by the time anyone actually did anything, the colony would be gone. How long for the council to respond? Amanda asked. 3 weeks minimum, Kyle said, his voice flat and cold in a way that made Amanda step back slightly. He stood up and requested permission to address the council on an emergency matter. Valinara granted him the floor with a curious tilt of her crystalline head. Kyle explained the situation in calm, measured tones while representatives from various species murmured among themselves. The Krath representative, a massive being covered in biomechanical armor, stood and declared that his people were operating within legal boundaries since the colony was in disputed space. Disputed by whom? Kyle asked quietly. By us. The Krath responded with what might have been amusement. And we have the strength to claim it while you do not. The chamber fell silent because everyone knew this was technically true. Humanity had demilitarized when joining the council, scrapping their warships and keeping only civilian vessels and light defensive platforms. Kyle stared at the Krath representative for a long moment and then did something that surprised everyone, including Amanda. He smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I formally request emergency passage for all human vessels through council space, he said. And I invoke Article 73 of the Human Integration Treaty. Valinara's translator struggled with the obscure legal reference because Article 73 had never been invoked before. It took several minutes for the Council's legal systems to pull up the relevant text. The article was simple. In cases where human civilians faced imminent threat and Council response time exceeded the threat timeline, humanity reserved the right to mobilize their own resources for evacuation and defense. You have cargo ships and medical transports, the Krath representative said dismissively. What do you plan to do with them? Whatever is necessary, Kyle replied back on New Haven. Colony Director Brendan Hayes stood in the operations center and watched the Krath fleet on his displays. 30 warships in a blockade formation, more than enough firepower to crack the colony's shields in minutes. His communications officer, a young woman named Lisa Carter, who usually taught elementary school but had emergency training for the ops center, looked at him with barely controlled fear. What do we do? She asked. Brandon had already made his decision. He pulled up the emergency transmission system and entered a code that he had hoped never to use. A specific sequence that would broadcast on all human frequencies across known space. Lisa recognized the code from her training, and her eyes went wide. Are you sure? She asked. Do you know what that will trigger? There are children here, Brandon said simply. My daughter Emma is in the classroom wing right now, and I will not let her grow up as a refugee or worse. He activated the transmission. The signal went out instantly, propagating through the human communications network at faster than light speeds. Within minutes, every human vessel, station, and settlement received the same message. It was not a call for help in the traditional sense. It was something far more specific and far more serious. Captain Ryan Foster was hauling medical supplies between stations when his ship's communication system chimed with the emergency code. He was 3 sectors away from New Haven, and his vessel, the merchant ship Horizon's Edge, was completely unarmed. His first officer looked at the message and then at Ryan with confusion. We are not military, he said. We have no weapons and no training for this kind of situation. Ryan was already plotting a new course. Does not matter, he said. The code was sent and there are children there, so we go. We will die. His first officer pointed out. Maybe, Ryan agreed. But we go anyway, because that is what humans do. The same scene played out on dozens of ships across human space. Cargo haulers changed course. Research vessels abandoned their studies. Passenger liners diverted from their scheduled routes. And every single one of them turned toward New Haven. Back in the council chamber, Kyle received confirmation that the signal had been sent and what it meant. Amanda saw his expression change again, saw something ancient and implacable settle over his features. What happens now? She asked quietly. Kyle pulled up a display showing ship movements across human space. Hundreds of signatures were converging on New Haven. Everything from massive colony ships to small personal transports. Now, he said, the galaxy remembers why they should have feared us. The Krath representative accessed the same data and laughed. You send unarmed merchants against a war fleet? He asked. This proves what we have always known. Humans are sentimental fools. Kyle did not respond to the insult. Instead, he sent a single encrypted message to an address that had not been used in over a century and a half deep in the darkness between stars. in a region of space that showed nothing on any galactic map. Something began to wake up. Automated systems that had been dormant for generations started running startup sequences. Fusion reactors that had been in standby mode for longer than most species had known about humanity began cycling to full power. Admiral Christine Blake opened her eyes in her quarters aboard the EDF Retribution and saw the message. She had been trained her entire life to expect but never thought would actually come. She smiled grimly and reached for her uniform around her. 500 warships that had been hidden in the dark for over 150 years began to move. Kyle looked at the Krath representative and spoke quietly, enough that only those nearby could hear. "You should have left when you had the chance." The children of New Haven had no idea that 30 warships hung in orbit above them with enough firepower to turn their home into molten glass. Lisa Carter kept her classroom running on schedule because routine helped during crisis, and the kids needed to feel safe. Emma, her 8-year-old daughter, sat in the front row and worked on a math problem about crop yields while Lisa watched the clock and tried not to think about the deadline that was counting down in the operations center. Brandon Hayes studied the tactical display and watched more human ships arrive in the system every hour. They came from every direction, appearing out of FTL with transponder codes identifying them as merchants, research vessels, colony transports, and even a few luxury cruise liners. None of them were warships, and none of them had weapons worth mentioning. Yet they kept coming. The Krath commander, a veteran officer named Zraxkal, who had fought in 17 campaigns, observed the human vessels with growing confusion. His tactical officer reported each new arrival and noted their complete lack of military capability. "They are cargo ships," Zraxkal said to his second-in-command. "What do they think they will accomplish?" "Perhaps they plan to evacuate the colony." His officer suggested. Zraxkal considered this possibility and dismissed it. There were not enough human ships to evacuate 50,000 people in the remaining time, and besides, the colony had not requested evacuation clearance through proper channels. No. This was something else, and it made no tactical sense. Captain Ryan Foster brought the Horizon's Edge into New Haven's orbital space and immediately began coordinating with the other civilian vessels that had responded to the distress code. Within hours, they had organized themselves into a defensive screen between the colony and the Krath fleet. Ryan knew this was insane from a military perspective. Putting unarmed cargo haulers against battle cruisers was suicide and would not even slow down a serious attack. But the code had been sent, and he had 2 daughters back home who he wanted to grow up in a galaxy where humans protected children no matter the cost. If that meant dying in a rust bucket cargo ship, then so be it. His first officer, a man named Greg Palmer, who had served with Ryan for 10 years, stood beside him on the bridge and watched the Krath fleet on their sensors. "We cannot win this fight," Greg said quietly. "We do not have to win," Ryan replied. "We just have to buy time." "Time for what?" Greg asked. "The Council will not respond fast enough, and we have no military to send." Ryan smiled in a way that made Greg nervous. "You have been in human space your whole life," Ryan said. "Did they never teach you our history?" "I know humanity had wars before joining the Council," Greg said. "But you gave up your military as part of the integration treaty." "We gave up our offensive capabilities," Ryan corrected. "We scrapped our invasion fleets and our planet-killer weapons and all the things we built when we thought we were alone in the universe and might need to fight for survival." Greg waited for Ryan to continue. "But we never gave up our right to defend ourselves," Ryan finished. "We just put those defenses somewhere the Council would not worry about them." Before Greg could ask what that meant, the sensors registered new contacts emerging from FDL at the system's edge. These were not cargo ships or civilian transports. The signatures were massive, military-grade, and moving with the kind of precision that only came from dedicated warship designs. Brandon Hayes, saw them appear on his tactical display and felt relief wash over him for the first time since the Krath arrived. He opened a channel to the colony-wide communication system. "All residents of New Haven," he announced. "This is Director Hayes, and I am here to tell you that everything is going to be all right because the Earth Defense Fleet has arrived." In the council chamber, chaos erupted as sensors across the galactic network picked up the emerging human fleet. 500 warships had appeared seemingly from nowhere, and every species in the chamber began demanding explanations. Ambassador Kyle Morrison stood calmly while representatives shouted questions and accusations. Valinara called for order and then turned her ancient gaze on the human delegation. "Explain this immediately," she commanded. "Humanity agreed to demilitarize 2 centuries ago, and these vessels violate every treaty you signed." Kyle pulled up a data file and projected it for the entire council to see. It showed the exact wording of the Human Integration Treaty, specifically the sections on military reduction. "We agreed to scrap all offensive military vessels," he said. "And we did exactly that. We destroyed every ship designed for invasion, conquest, or territorial expansion." "Then what are those?" the Vrexian representative demanded, pointing at the fleet display. "Those are the Earth Defense Fleet," Kyle replied. "Vessels designed and built for exactly one purpose: protecting human civilians from external threats. You deceived us." Someone shouted from the gallery. "We followed the letter of our agreement," Kyle said coldly. "You assumed we would leave ourselves defenseless, and we allowed you to make that assumption. But we never lied about our capabilities." Amanda Pierce stood beside him and whispered urgently, "Kyle, they are going to expel us from the council for this." "Let them try," Kyle said. "Right now, I do not care about politics because there are 15,000 children on New Haven who are about to learn that humanity will cross any line to keep them safe." Valinara studied the human ambassador for a long moment and then accessed historical files that most species had forgotten. She found records of Earth before first contact, of human wars and conflicts that had killed billions. "Your species has a violent history," she said. "And you hid this fleet because you knew we would fear it." "We hid this fleet because we learned something from our violent history," Kyle corrected. "We learned that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to be willing to become monsters. And we swore we would never again be unable to defend our children." The Krath representative finally found his voice. "This is an outrageous breach of trust," he declared. "The Dominion will not tolerate this deception." "The Dominion threatened human children," Kyle said, turning to face the armored alien directly. "And now you will learn what happens when you wake the part of humanity we tried to leave behind aboard the EDF Retribution." Admiral Christine Blake reviewed the tactical situation and felt the familiar weight of command settle over her shoulders. She had spent 30 years training for a moment she hoped would never come. Drilling with weapon systems that were supposed to remain in storage forever. The Retribution was a dreadnought-class vessel, nearly 2 kilometers long and armed with weapon systems that incorporated 2 centuries of human innovation. She had been built in secret at a shipyard hidden in a nebula. Along with the rest of the EDF, Christine had volunteered for this assignment when she was just out of the academy. Most humans never knew the EDF existed, and those who did were carefully selected for their dedication to protecting others. Her tactical officer was a young man named Kevin Wright, who had inherited his position from his father. The EDF ran on legacy volunteers, families who dedicated themselves to being humanity's hidden shield. Status of the Krath fleet. Christine asked. Kevin consulted his displays. 30 capital ships in standard blockade formation, he reported. They have not changed position since we arrived, and they have not powered weapons. They are waiting to see what we will do, Christine said. They still think humans are too peaceful to actually fight. She opened a channel to the Krath commander directly. The transmission was audio, only because she wanted Zraxkal to focus on her words rather than trying to read human expressions. "This is Admiral Christine Blake of the Earth Defense Fleet," she said. "You have threatened human civilians, including children, and you have been asked to leave peacefully." Zraxkal responded immediately. "You have no authority here," he said. "This system is in disputed space, and the Krath Dominion has superior claim. I am not interested in legal arguments," Christine replied. "I am giving you 1 hour to withdraw your fleet beyond the system boundary, and if you do not comply, I will demonstrate why humanity's most feared weapon is not our ships or our technology." "And what is this weapon?" Zraxkal asked with clear amusement. "What we become when you threaten our families," Christine said, and closed the channel. She turned to Kevin and began issuing orders. The entire fleet moved into attack positions with practiced efficiency. 500 warships deploying in formations that had been rehearsed thousands of times, but never used in actual combat aboard the horizon's edge. Ryan Foster watched the EDF take position and felt both relief and sadness. Relief because the children would be safe. Sadness because he knew what was about to happen. The Krath had no idea what they had triggered, and Ryan had studied enough human history to know that humanity at war was something terrible to witness. His communication panel chimed with a message from Admiral Blake. All civilian vessels were ordered to maintain their positions between the colony and the Krath fleet. Greg Palmer looked at Ryan in shock. "She wants us to stay in the firing line?" he asked. "She is giving the Krath one last chance to see what they are facing," Ryan said. "She wants them to understand that humans will die to protect children, even children who are not their own." The hour deadline began counting down, and the entire galaxy held its breath. The deadline expired with no response from the Krath fleet and commander. Zraxkal stood on his command bridge, feeling confident in his decision to hold position. The Dominion High Command had sent him clear orders after reviewing the situation, and those orders were simple. Do not retreat. The appearance of human warships had surprised everyone, but the Dominion's military analysts had reviewed the available data and concluded that humanity was bluffing. 200 years of peaceful behavior could not be erased by a show of force, and humans would not risk galactic war over a single colonist Rax. Cal agreed with this assessment because everything he knew about humans suggested they avoided violence whenever possible. They ran hospitals and schools. They rescued stranded vessels regardless of species. They even kept pets and cried over fictional stories. These were not the behaviors of warriors, and Zraxkal had fought enough real warriors to know the difference. Tactical officer reported that the human civilian vessels were still maintaining their defensive screen between the colony and the Krath fleet. This confirmed Zraxkal's analysis because no military commander would put unarmed cargo ships in a battle zone unless they were absolutely certain no battle would occur. Target the colonies. Power generation facilities, Zraxkal ordered. A precision strike to demonstrate our seriousness without causing casualties. His weapons officer began locking firing solutions while Zraxkal opened a channel to the colony director. He would give the humans one more chance to evacuate peacefully before escalating further. Brandon Hayes received the incoming transmission and accepted it with his jaw clenched tight. He had just finished moving all the children into the underground shelters, and Lisa Carter was down there with them, reading stories to keep them calm. Zraxkal's voice came through with mechanical precision. "Colony Director Hayes," the Krath commander said, "my patience has limits, and I will now demonstrate the consequences of refusing to cooperate." Brandon saw the weapons lock appear on his display and knew exactly what was about to happen. The Krath were going to fire on the power stations as a warning shot, trying to force evacuation without direct civilian casualties. "Fire," Zraxkal commanded the Krath weapons discharged and plasma bolts lanced across space toward New Haven. They would impact in approximately 30 seconds, and Brandon could do nothing but watch. Then something happened that Zraxkal had not anticipated. Captain Ryan Foster saw the incoming fire on his sensors and made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. He fired the Horizon's Edge's maneuvering thrusters and moved his ship directly into the path of the plasma bolts. "What are you doing?" Greg Palmer shouted. "They are aiming for the colony," Ryan said calmly, "and we are in the way." The plasma hit the Horizon's Edge amidships and tore through the cargo hauler's hull like it was paper. The ship's reactor went critical immediately, and Ryan had just enough time to order evacuation before the explosion tore his vessel apart. But the plasma bolts never reached New Haven because Ryan's ship had absorbed the entire salvo aboard 30 other civilian vessels. Captains made the same choice in the same instant. They moved their unarmed ships into the firing line and took hits meant for the colony surface. Admiral Christine Blake watched this happen from the Retribution and felt something cold and ancient settle into her chest. She had known humans were willing to sacrifice for others, but seeing it happen in real time was different from knowing it intellectually. "All ships," she said quietly. "They have drawn our blood, and now we show them the cost." The EDF fleet moved forward. Zraxo stared at his tactical display in shock as he watched civilian vessels deliberately sacrifice themselves. He had expected the humans to back down, or at least move their ships to safety, not throw them into the path of weapons fire. His tactical officer reported that 12 human cargo ships had been destroyed or disabled in the opening salvo, and the human military fleet was now advancing at attack speed. "They are actually going to fight," Zraxkal said in disbelief. His second-in-command urged him to withdraw before the situation escalated further, but Zraxkal had his orders, and the Dominion did not tolerate commanders who retreated from inferior forces. The human fleet might be larger than expected, but they had been peaceful traders for 2 centuries, and the Krath were veteran warriors. Numbers alone did not win battles. "All ships prepare for combat," Zraxkal ordered. "We will teach these merchants what real warfare means." The Krath fleet broke formation and moved to engage 30 capital ships with crews that had trained for war since childhood, equipped with weapon systems that had been tested in dozens of conflicts. They expected the humans to fight like other council species, cautiously, with careful formations and predictable tactics designed to minimize casualties. They were catastrophically wrong. The EDF hit them like a hurricane. Admiral Blake had divided her fleet into strike groups that moved with inhuman coordination. Fighter wings launched from carrier vessels and executed attack runs that made Krath pilots question their sensors because the maneuvers should have been physically impossible. Human dreadnoughts opened fire with railguns that accelerated projectiles to relativistic speeds. The kinetic impact alone was enough to crack Krath shields, and the secondary plasma charges that detonated on impact turned shield failures into hull breaches. Zraxkal watched his fleet take damage and realized with horror that the humans were not fighting like traders or merchants. They were fighting like a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other. His tactical officer reported casualties mounting and requested permission to withdraw, but Zraxkal was too shocked to respond immediately. He had expected a brief skirmish followed by negotiation, not this coordinated assault. The Retribution closed the weapons range of Zraxkal's flagship, and Christine Blake made a decision. She ordered precise targeting of the ships, weapon systems and engines while avoiding crew sections. The human weapons tore into the Krath flagship with surgical precision, And within minutes, Draxskull's ship was disabled but intact. His crew was alive, but the vessel was helpless across the battlespace. The same pattern repeated. Krath ships that stopped firing were disabled but not destroyed, while those that continued fighting were hit with overwhelming force. Kevin Wright reported the tactical situation to Admiral Blake. 15 Krath vessels destroyed, 12 disabled including the flagship, and 3 retreating at maximum speed. The battle had lasted 20 minutes. Casualties? Christine asked. EDF losses are minimal, Kevin reported. But we lost 47 civilian vessels in the opening exchange, including the Horizon's Edge. Christine closed her eyes briefly. 47 ships full of volunteers who had come unarmed to protect strangers and had died doing exactly that. Begin rescue operations immediately, she ordered. I want every Krath survivor pulled from those wrecks, and I want our people recovered with full honors. Draxskull sat in his damaged command center and tried to process what had happened. His flagship was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, and half his crew was dead or injured. Then, something appeared on his sensors that made no sense. Human ships were approaching the Krath wrecks and deploying rescue craft. His communications officer, injured but functional, reported incoming transmission from the humans. Draxskull accepted it numbly. Commander Draxskull, a human voice said. This is Rescue Team 7 from the EDF Retribution, and we are coming to extract your crew. Why? Draxskull asked, genuinely confused. Because the battle is over and you are no longer a threat, the human replied. And because leaving sapient beings to die in space is not something humans do. Within an hour, human Marines in combat armor were cutting through the flagship's hull and pulling Krath crew members to safety. Draxskull found himself being carried by a human soldier who handled him with surprising gentleness despite the fact that they had been trying to kill each other minutes earlier. He was brought aboard a human medical ship where doctors immediately began treating his injuries. A human physician explained each procedure before performing it and asked if he was comfortable, as Draxskull had fought in 17 campaigns and had never experienced anything like this. Victorious forces did not typically provide medical care to defeated enemies in the council chamber. Representatives watched the battle footage in stunned silence. The entire engagement had been broadcast on open channels, and every species had witnessed humanity's hidden capability. But more shocking than the military might was what came after. The same humans who had torn apart a Krath fleet with ruthless efficiency were now working frantically to save Krath lives. Velinara turned to Ambassador Kyle Morrison and spoke quietly. Your species is a paradox, she said, capable of terrible violence, yet compelled to show mercy. We are capable of violence, Kyle agreed. But we choose mercy whenever possible, and we only become violent when you threaten the things we love. The Krath representative stood shakily. His entire body language had changed from aggressive posturing to something approaching fear. The Dominion has made a grave error, he said, and we formally withdraw all claims to New Haven and offer reparations for our actions. Kyle nodded acknowledgement, but his expression remained cold. Your offer is noted, he said, but understand that this will not be forgotten, and if the Krath Dominion ever threatens human civilians again. 3 weeks after the battle, the Galactic Council convened an emergency tribunal, and Ambassador Kyle Morrison stood before the assembled representatives, knowing that humanity's future in galactic society hung in the balance. That the charges were serious. Treaty violations, maintaining a secret military force, using excessive force against a council member species, and deliberately deceiving the galactic community for 2 centuries. Kyle had not tried to deny any of it, because the evidence was overwhelming, and honestly, he did not care about the political consequences as much as he cared about the principle at stake. Admiral Christine Blake sat in the witness section wearing her formal uniform. She had brought the entire command staff of the Retribution as a show of solidarity and to demonstrate that the EDF stood behind its actions. Lisa Carter was there too, brought as a civilian witness along with Brandon Hayes and several other colonists from New Haven. The council had wanted to hear directly from the people humanity claimed to be protecting. The proceedings began with council speaker Velanara reading the formal charges. Her ancient voice carried weight and sorrow, because she had genuinely liked humanity before discovering their deception. "Ambassador Morrison," she said, "how does humanity answer these charges?" Kyle stood and faced the council directly. "We do not contest the facts as presented," he said. "We did maintain a military fleet in secret. We did use force against the Krath Dominion. And we did intentionally allow the council to believe we were fully demilitarized." Murmurs ran through the chamber and several representatives demanded immediate sanctions. "However," Kyle continued, raising his voice slightly, "we contend that our actions were both necessary and morally justified given the circumstances." The Vrexian representative stood and spoke with barely controlled anger. "You lied to us for 200 years. He declared, "You violated the spirit of every treaty you signed, and you have proven that humanity cannot be trusted." Kyle met the Vrexian's glare without flinching. "We followed the exact letter of our treaties," he said, "and we maintained a defensive capability because the Council's own rules made it clear that protection of our people would not always be your priority." Velanara called for order and then invited Kyle to present his defense. He pulled up historical records and displayed them for the entire chamber in the past 50 years alone. Kyle said, "There have been 47 incidents where human colonies or vessels requested council protection, and the response time exceeded the threat timeline." The display showed case after case. Pirate raids on mining colonies that ended before security forces arrived. Slavers taking human civilians while council ships were still in transit. Border disputes that turned violent while committees debated jurisdiction. "We are not saying the council is incompetent," Kyle explained. "We are saying that the council is large and bureaucratic, and sometimes that means people die while waiting for help." He pulled up another file showing the New Haven situation. The Krath issued a 24-hour ultimatum, and the council's own estimate said intervention would take 3 weeks minimum. "So we chose to protect our own people rather than wait for a rescue that would come too late." The Krath representative, a different individual than the one who had been present during the initial confrontation, rose to speak. "The Dominion acknowledges our error in threatening the colony," he said carefully. "But we note that humanity responded with overwhelming force that resulted in significant casualties and the destruction of valuable military assets." Admiral Blake requested permission to address the tribunal, and Velanara granted it. Christine walked to the center of the chamber and stood at attention. "I commanded the EDF fleet at New Haven," she said, "and I take full responsibility for the tactical decisions made during the engagement." She pulled up the battle footage and displayed it in detail. "The Krath fleet fired first," she explained, targeting civilian structures on the colony surface, and when that fire was intercepted by unarmed human vessels, they opened fire on those vessels as well. The footage showed Ryan Foster's cargo ship and the others deliberately moving into the path of plasma fire. 47 civilian ships were destroyed in the opening salvo. Christine continued, "Those were volunteers who came unarmed knowing they might die. And they did die protecting children who were strangers to them." She zoomed in on the tactical data. "When the EDF engaged, we offered quarter to every Krath vessel that ceased fire, and we targeted weapon systems and engines to disable rather than destroy wherever possible." The numbers supported her claim. Out of 30 Krath ships, only 15 had been destroyed, and most of those had continued firing even after being given opportunities to surrender. Furthermore, Christine added, "We immediately began rescue operations to save Krath survivors and provided full medical treatment to injured enemy personnel. She turned to face the Krath representative directly. If humanity wanted to demonstrate overwhelming force without restraint, we could have destroyed your entire fleet in the first volley and left no survivors. But we chose mercy even in the midst of combat, because that is who we are. The chamber fell silent as representatives absorbed this information. Vela called Lisa Carter to testify next. The schoolteacher approached the witness stand nervously while her daughter, Emma, watched from the gallery. Tell us what happened from your perspective. Valinara said gently. Lisa described the Krath ultimatum, the fear of the colonists, and the decision to send the distress code. She talked about sheltering in the underground bunkers with 15,000 children while wondering if they would ever see the surface again. The people on those cargo ships did not know us, Lisa said, her voice shaking slightly. They had never met my daughter or any of the other children, but they came anyway, and they died to give us time. She pulled up a holographic image showing Captain Ryan Foster's personnel file. This man had 2 daughters at home, she said, and he chose to fly his unarmed ship into weapons fire because somewhere on New Haven there were children who reminded him of his own. Emma started crying quietly in the gallery, and several of the representatives shifted uncomfortably. Brandon Hayes testified about the practical realities of frontier colony life. They were too far from Council security forces to rely on protection and too small to defend themselves with conventional means. We requested enhanced security measures 6 times in the past 5 years, he said. And each time we were told that resources were limited and our risk assessment did not justify additional protection. He displayed the rejection notices. The Council told us we were safe, and then the Krath arrived with 30 warships, and suddenly we were not safe at all. The tribunal continued for hours with testimony from both sides. The Krath presented evidence of their territorial claims and argued that humanity had overreacted to a legal dispute. Human witnesses countered with recordings of Krath transmissions threatening civilian casualties if the colony did not evacuate. Finally, Valinara called for closing statements. The Vrexian representative spoke for the prosecution. Humanity has proven itself willing to deceive the Council and maintain secret military forces, he argued. If we allow this behavior to stand, what prevents other species from doing the same? And we will descend into an arms race that destroys everything we have built. Kyle stood for the defense. The Council was founded on the principle that all sapient life deserves protection, he said. The protection requires capability, and the Council's own bureaucracy sometimes prevents that protection from arriving in time. He gestured to the footage of the civilian ships. Those people died because they believed in protecting the innocent, even at the cost of their own lives. And if the Council punishes humanity for having the capability to back up that belief, then the Council has lost sight of its founding principles. Valinara called for a recess while the Council deliberated. The wait lasted 6 hours, and Kyle spent most of it sitting with Amanda Pierce and reviewing their contingency plans if humanity was expelled from galactic society. When the Council reconvened, Valinara looked older than her already ancient age. This tribunal has concluded its deliberations, she announced, and we have reached a verdict through majority vote. The chamber fell completely silent. Humanity is found guilty of violating the demilitarization agreements through maintenance of a secret military fleet, Valinara said, and this violation cannot be ignored without undermining the foundations of Council law. Kyle nodded. Having expected this outcome, however, Valinara continued, the Council also acknowledges that humanity's actions at New Haven were undertaken in defense of civilians facing imminent threat and were conducted with restraint, despite overwhelming tactical advantage. She looked directly at Kyle. The Council has debated extensively whether the spirit of our laws is better served by punishment or by adaptation, and we have chosen adaptation. Valinara announced the terms. Humanity would formally register the Earth Defense Fleet with the Council and accept oversight of their military capabilities. But the fleet would remain operational under human command. Additionally, the Council would implement new emergency response protocols to ensure faster protection for frontier colonies of all species. Finally, Valinara said, "The Council wishes to formally recognize the sacrifice of the 47 civilian volunteers who gave their lives at New Haven, and..." 6 months after the tribunal, New Haven colony had been rebuilt and expanded. The Krath reparations had funded new defensive platforms and upgraded infrastructure, but more importantly, the colony had become a symbol of something larger than itself. Lisa Carter stood in the central plaza, where a memorial had been erected. 47 names were carved in the black stone, each one representing a civilian volunteer who had died intercepting fire meant for the colony. Captain Ryan Foster's name was at the top, followed by Greg Palmer and the rest of the Horizon's Edge crew. Below them were the names of captains and crew members from cargo haulers, research vessels, and even a luxury liner that had been on a sightseeing tour when the distress code was sent. Emma placed flowers at the base of the memorial, like she did every week. Her mother had explained what Captain Foster did and why he did it, and Emma had decided she wanted to be like him when she grew up. He had daughters? Emma asked for the 100th time. "Yes," Lisa confirmed again. "2 girls about your age, and he chose to protect you even though it meant leaving them." Emma thought about this for a moment. "Will they hate me for that?" she asked quietly. Lisa knelt down beside her daughter. "No, sweetheart," she said, "because they understand what their father understood, that protecting children is not about choosing which ones matter most. It is about believing that all of them matter equally." Brandon Hayes joined them at the memorial. His daughter had returned from her studies on Earth, specifically to attend the 6-month remembrance ceremony. "The Council is sending representatives," Brandon said. "And Admiral Blake is coming with a full honor guard from the EDF." Lisa nodded. The memorial had become an important site, not just for humans, but for the entire galactic community and species. From across Council space sent delegations to pay respects. What had started as a human tragedy had become a shared moment of reflection about what mattered most to civilized society on Earth. Admiral Christine Blake prepared for the trip to New Haven. She had visited the families of every volunteer who died that day, and each visit had been harder than Combat Ryan Foster's. Daughters had thanked her for coming and told her their father had talked about serving humanity even if he never wore a uniform. He had believed that protecting others was everyone's responsibility, not just the military. Christine carried that conversation with her every day, and it informed how she commanded the EDF. They were not conquerors or warriors in the traditional sense. They were protectors who happened to have weapons. The EDF had changed since being officially recognized by the Council. They now conducted joint exercises with other species' defense forces and had established protocols for rapid response to threats against any Council member, but the core mission remained the same: ensure that no human colony would ever face destruction while help was too far away. Kevin Wright, now promoted to commander, joined Christine on the shuttle to New Haven. He had been with her during the battle and had helped coordinate the rescue operations afterward. "How do you think the galaxy sees us now?" he asked. Christine considered the question. "Some fear us," she said. "Some respect us, and some still do not trust us. But all of them understand that we mean what we say about protecting children." She pulled up reports from across Council space. In the 6 months since New Haven, there had been 12 incidents where human vessels responded to distress calls from other species. In every case, humans had put themselves at risk to protect strangers, evacuating colonies threatened by natural disasters, defending merchant convoys from pirates, providing emergency medical care in crisis situations. We are proving through actions that our capability for violence is matched by our commitment to mercy, Christine said. And eventually, that will matter more than the fact that we hid the EDF at the Galactic Council. Ambassador Kyle Morrison had been working to implement the new emergency response protocols. It had been a bureaucratic nightmare, but the results were already showing. Improvement response times for Frontier Colony. Protection had decreased by 60%, and the Council had established rapid deployment forces specifically trained for civilian defense. Ambassador Tralvin joined Kyle for lunch in the station's diplomatic quarter. They had become closer friends since the tribunal, and Tralvin had proven instrumental in building support for the new protocols. I heard the Craft Dominion is requesting human military advisors, Tralvin said with amusement. Kyle nodded. Commanders Raxcal specifically requested a training exchange program, he confirmed. Apparently, his experience at New Haven changed his perspective on military doctrine. The former craft commander had become an unlikely advocate for humanity within the Dominion. He regularly gave lectures on the importance of restraint in victory and the value of protecting civilians even during conflict. He told his superiors that humanity fights like a species that has learned from its mistakes, Kyle explained. And he wants the Dominion to learn those same lessons without having to make the mistakes. First, Tralvin raised his glass in a toast. To humanity, he said, the species that hid warships in the dark but chose to use them for protection rather than conquest. Kyle accepted the toast but added his own addendum. And to the 47 who proved that courage is not about having weapons. It is about choosing to stand between danger and the innocent. On New Haven. The remembrance ceremony began with Admiral Blake speaking to the assembled crowd. Colonists, council representatives, and EDF personnel all gathered around the memorial 6 months ago, Christine said. 47 people made a choice that defined not just humanity, but the kind of galaxy we want to live in. She gestured to the names on the memorial. These were not soldiers, and they did not die in a fair fight. They died because they chose to put their bodies between weapons fire and children they had never met. Emma Carter stood in the front row holding her mother's hand. Captain Ryan Foster had every reason to stay safe. Christine continued. He had a family waiting for him at home and a cargo hold full of medical supplies that were desperately needed elsewhere. But when the distress code was sent, he changed course because somewhere on this colony there were children who needed protection. She paused to let that sink in. That is humanity's true weapon, she said. Not our ships or our guns or our ability to fight, but our absolute refusal to abandon the innocent, even when it costs us everything. The ceremony continued with representatives from various species offering their own tributes. The Vrexian Empire sent a delegation that formally apologized for their initial condemnation of humanity's actions. Even the Craft Dominion sent representatives who spoke about how the battle had changed their understanding of strength. Real power was not just the ability to destroy, but the discipline to show mercy as the sun set over New Haven. Lisa and Emma walked back to their home through streets that had been rebuilt and gardens that had been replanted. The colony was thriving now, and new families were arriving every week. Many of them came, specifically because of the memorial and what it represented. They wanted to live in a place where the cost of protection had been so clearly demonstrated. Emma asked her mother if Captain Foster's daughters would ever visit New Haven. I hope so, Lisa said, because I think they would like to see what their father protected and meet the children who are alive because of his choice. That evening, Christine Blake stood alone at the memorial after everyone else had left. She placed a hand on Ryan Foster's name and made a silent promise. The EDF would continue to train, continue to prepare, and continue to maintain their ships in peak condition. But they would only ever use that capability for one purpose: protecting those who could not protect. themselves back in the darkness between stars. The 500 ships of the Earth Defense Fleet returned to their hidden stations. They would wait there, maintained and ready, for the next time someone threatened human civilians, but now the galaxy knew they existed and what they represented. Some species had begun establishing their own defensive fleets modeled on the EDF. The idea of maintaining military capability specifically for protection rather than conquest was spreading through. Council Space Valonera watched this development with mixed feelings. On one hand, more armed fleets meant more potential for conflict. But on the other hand, the motivation behind these fleets was fundamentally different from traditional military buildup. She called Kyle to her private office one evening and spoke candidly. "Your species has changed the galaxy," she said, "and I am not certain yet whether that change is for better or worse." Kyle understood her concern. "We did not want to change anything," he said. "We just wanted to protect our children, and it turned out the desire resonated with other species, because every sapient species has children," Valonara agreed. "And every parent understands the instinct to protect them at any cost." She pulled up data showing the galactic response to New Haven. Piracy had decreased significantly because raiders now knew that attacking civilians might trigger rapid military response, not just from the victim species, but from any nearby vessels that happened to intercept the distress call. "You have created something unexpected," Valonara said. "A galaxy where protection of the innocent is becoming a shared responsibility rather than a bureaucratic process." Kyle smiled slightly. "That is what we hoped for," he admitted. "We never wanted to be the only